Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a review of the Abxylute One Pro. This is a streaming focused handheld. It's Android based, and it's an upgraded version of one that came out a couple years ago that I reviewed here on this channel. Now in many ways this is a very similar handheld to what we saw before. Same kind of shell and ergonomics and overall control scheme, but there are some key upgrades. Number one being the chipset. It's much more powerful now, and it also has upgraded analog sticks, some of the best I've ever seen in a handheld. It's also focused on being a more budget handheld device. It's around $200 pre-order or $250 retail, so really the exact same price that it was a couple years back. And so in this video I want to focus on, all the good and bad that comes with this handheld, but then also what you could actually get around the $200, $250 price point if you're really just looking to stream something on a bigger screen. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, as we jump into it, I wanted to mention that this is a prototype unit sent from Abxylute, so it is not in the final stages of actual production. One of the dead giveaways is the texture here on the front. You can see that it's been slightly sanded or polished. It was probably 3D printed before it was sent over to me. However, the texture on the back is actually pretty good. It's got a nice matte texture on the plastic, and then it has this really textured ribbing right here along the edges. And so they've told me that this is what it's actually going to be like in the final retail version. I've also seen in their promo materials that they're going to be using a transparent shell option as well. So that's the one thing that's going to be different about this device in the early prototype stage as I'm testing it. But everything else should be largely the same. So let's dive into the specs and see what we have to work with. The big change here is that they have a new upgraded CPU. It's the MediaTek Genio 510. Now, this is my first time testing this chipset in particular, but some of the big highlights are the fact that it's a 6nm chip, and it also has 6 different cores. 2 of them are ARM Cortex A78 cores, clocked at 2 GHz, and then they have 4 additional ones, A55, again clocked at 2 GHz. We've also got 4 GB of LPDDR4 RAM, which I think is sufficient for a device that's focused on game streaming. It has 64 GB of internal storage, but also a micro SD card slot, so you can expand it if you would like. Now the screen here is pretty standard. It's 7 inches, 1080p in resolution, and with a 60 Hz refresh rate. These are the same screen specs as we saw on the previous Abxylute device, as well as other devices like the Logitech G Cloud. The battery here is 5200 mAh, and I found that gave me an average of 8 to 10 hours of battery life depending on what I was playing. Of note, it has 18-watt PD fast charging, and it charges very fast. I'm usually ready to go in about 30 to 45 minutes. In terms of weight, we're looking at 424 grams, or about 15 ounces, and that's almost the exact same weight as a Nintendo Switch OLED. As far as connectivity, we have Wi-Fi 6. It also is Bluetooth capable, but I wasn't able to figure it out on the spec sheet of what the Bluetooth version number is. Of note, the USB port on this device is also video out capable. It actually defaults to a 4K output. And it's really plug and play. I just used a USB-C to HDMI adapter, then plugged it into my 4K monitor, and it worked fine. However, one thing I did notice is that it did take a dip in performance when playing it on an external monitor. I think that some sort of processing is happening in order to show that 4K image. For example, when playing a GameCube game like NBA Street right here, this one at a 2x resolution plays just fine at 60 frames per second on the device itself. But when I plugged it in with an external monitor like this, it dropped down to about 40 or 45 frames per second. So I did notice a performance dip when using the video out, and unfortunately there are no settings to adjust the output display to something like 1080p instead. And what this means to me is that you're probably better off using the video out function for more retro gaming, as opposed to trying to push the limits to something like GameCube or PS2. In terms of operating system, this is running Android 13, and some other features include the fact that it has Hall sensor analog triggers, as well as these new analog sticks, which we'll talk about later. Now, because this device is so similar to the previous model that I reviewed a couple years ago, I wanted to revisit some of the things I liked and didn't like about that previous model, because I think that looking at these bullet points will help us to organize the rest of the video. Now, in terms of things I liked, most of these things are going to be the same. I liked the fact that we had a nice big 7-inch screen, and it was really good at Wi-Fi streaming. The older device also had analog triggers, same as we have here, and the audio quality was good back then, and it's actually been improved for this model too. I also found the device was good for retro gaming, and that mostly was because the chipset that they used previously was very low powered. And for the most part, those things are going to be the same with the Absolute One Pro. It's got the same style screen and everything else. We'll dive more into that. But in general, those are the things I liked about the previous model. But I think more importantly are the things I didn't like about the previous model to see if they've been addressed with this new one. And I had 4 main complaints in that previous video. The first was that it had rather sharp angles around the edge of it, and I think that it took away from the overall ergonomics. In addition, I didn't like the diagonals on the D-pad. It took away from the overall retro gaming experience as well. And then finally, even though the original Absolute was also focused on game streaming, I thought that the emulation performance on it was pretty lousy. Like, it couldn't really even play Dreamcast or Nintendo 64. So let's talk about those 4 aspects and some of the other things I didn't like about the original model and see how they have changed over the past couple years. So number 1 were the sharp angles along the edge of the device, as well as the poor ergonomics because it is relatively flat, and unfortunately those have not changed at all. And that's because the overall shell doesn't look to have been changed in any way over the past couple of years. It's really just the exact same experience. Now, I've discussed this a lot when it comes to game streaming focused devices, and I have very specific preferences, and I like them to be big and chunky. The way I see it, when you're playing a streaming device, you mostly are going to be playing it at home, so you might as well make it as comfortable as possible. But unfortunately, when it comes to a really flat device like this, it always feels like they're focusing on the portability aspect, when that's not really that big of a concern for me. And so I've always found that the ergonomic design here is just a little bit weird. Like, it has this strange kind of design to it, but it doesn't really seem to fit human hands. There's definitely a spot to be able to grip your hands around, but it does feel relatively cramped, which is kind of weird for a 7-inch device. In addition, I don't like the fact that the corners here just kind of go to a point, because you will feel that with your hands as you're holding it. It just kind of presses against your hands the entire time. And I think the best-in-class example of a streaming-focused handheld that has a 7-inch display remains the Logitech G Cloud. This one's got a lot of things going for it in terms of ergonomics. Number 1, it has a more teardrop shape to it, which allows you to be able to grip the device a lot more easily. In addition, it's got very rounded grips, as you can see right here, which are really well form-fitted, and so they feel like they're actually made for a human hand. And so I've always liked the ergonomics on the G Cloud. I think it's one of the best out there. And it's something that I had issues with the first Absolute, and it's still definitely here again. I remember in my first review saying that I spent more time playing the G Cloud than the actual Absolute during its review period, because I felt this one was just a lot more comfortable. Another larger Android-based handheld that I also think does really well when it comes to ergonomics is the Odin 2 Portal, with a big old caveat, and that is that you kind of need the TPU grip to actually make it comfortable, because without the grip, I don't actually think it's very good. But with the grip, it really is one of my favorite streaming handhelds. And so right off the bat, again, the Absolute One Pro is at a disadvantage, because these ergonomics just do not feel very comfortable for me. I've had this device for about 2.5 weeks over this review period, and much like with my previous example, I didn't really play this one that much, just because, yeah, I got it up and running, but as soon as I started to actually stream with it, after a few minutes, I just wanted to play with something else. Now, in all fairness, I probably should have just stuck it out and played with this thing since I was reviewing it, but the fact that I wanted to play with something else was indicative enough to me that, yes, these ergonomics are a problem. I'm not sure if Absolute can actually fix it. They've had 2 years, they didn't do anything about it. Maybe they could add a grip to it and kind of improve those ergonomics, but as it stands right now, it was a detractor in my first review, and it's still something that I don't like in this one as well. Now, my third issue with the original Absolute was the D-pad diagonals. I found that it did not pass the Contra test. I'm happy to say that they have improved the D-pad today. It's a lot more tactile and more responsive. In fact, when testing it with the exact same Contra test, it does absolutely fine. I'm able to press down on the D-pad and rock it left and right slightly, and the character doesn't move. But if I try to push it all the way to one side or the other, I can move the character, and that's kind of the sweet spot for me. I want to be able to not have accidental diagonals, but also hit them when I want to. And so, yes, this is passing the Contra test, unlike the original model. I think they did a pretty good balance here, because even when it comes to the Street Fighter test, when I'm trying to hit a diagonal, it's also doing very well. And so I don't really have any issues with this D-pad at this point. It does exactly what I want to when I want it to. And so this is something that's definitely been improved since the previous model, and I really like the feel of this D-pad today. And then finally, the fourth thing I had issues with was the actual emulation performance on this device, and that has been greatly improved. I go through all the systems later in this video. I'll have it timestamped down below. So when it comes down to it, 2 out of 4 is not bad. The overall ergonomics and the sharpness of the edges here on the device are still the same. So that's still very polarizing. I know some people like it, but I definitely do not. But the other things that I didn't like about this device, the D-pad as well as the performance, those have been improved. And there are other things that are better too. So let's talk about that. And number one thing here is going to be these analog sticks. I really can't say enough good things about them. They're a little bit on the small side. Like they're not as big as an Xbox controller sticks, but they are still very good. They're a little bit bigger than say something like on a Retroid Pocket 5 or the Odin 2, but they also just have a really nice smooth feeling to them. I also like the grips on them. They've got a nice texture to them on the outside, but then are also a little bit concave. And so I've had a really good time playing with these sticks. In particular, when playing analog stick-centric games, say something like Super Mario 64, you can feel every little movement here. So it feels like a true analog experience, and it is much better than the original model. In fact, I still have my original model. Now, unfortunately, this one does not power on. This was also an early prototype, and I don't know, it just kind of went kaput over time. But I can show you at least the old analog sticks, which were essentially just Nintendo Switch sticks. And, these had a really limited range of motion and just didn't feel very good, especially on a device designed for streaming. With this new model, we finally have sticks that actually fit the overall feel of the device. And so I've really enjoyed using these sticks in particular. They're probably some of the best that I've found on a retro handheld. When doing an input test, you can see that I can move just basically anywhere I want. It does have a circular input, which may cause issues depending on the type of game that you're playing, but overall it feels very, very smooth. And so this is probably the number one biggest improvement that I've found, is these are really good analog sticks. I hope that we see them in future handhelds. I'm not sure who made them, who the actual manufacturer is, but those people deserve a raise. Now, on the subject of controls, let's talk about these buttons as well. I think they're actually pretty good. They are rubber membrane, and they feel actually pretty tactile and responsive. I've been told that the overall play of these buttons might change when we get the retail shell, but as it stands right now, I didn't have any complaints about the buttons whatsoever in my couple weeks of testing. In terms of other buttons, we got select and start up here. These work fine. They're a little bit clicky. And then down below, we've got 2 menu buttons. So this one right here is actually an Xbox home button, and it works with the Xbox app. So when you press this, it's like pressing the Xbox button on your controller. And this button on the right is your Android home button. Unfortunately, there is no back button. So you're going to do a lot of swiping to get back into the menus, or you can press home to just take you right back here. Up top, we've got volume up and down buttons, and then our power and sleep button, as well as a microphone input. Now let's talk about the shoulder and triggers, which you can see right here. The shoulder buttons are a little bit clicky. They are micro switches and a little bit on the loud side, but I wouldn't say they're terrible. They are relatively easy to press down on, but I do wish they were a little bit more dampened. As far as the triggers, these are an analog input and actually feel pretty good. They are a little bit on the short side in terms of throw, but I don't really have any complaints about them when actually using them. Again, if we go back into that input tester app, I can get all the way from 0 to 100%, and so no issues whatsoever when it comes to the analog trigger input. If I wanted to be really nitpicky, I would say that these triggers are a little bit on the flappy side compared to something that's just a little bit more solid of a push down. I prefer, an Xbox controller trigger as opposed to something like this. There's not a lot going on in the back other than the textures that I mentioned before and these kind of wild ergonomics, all things considered. And then finally on the bottom, we've got another microphone input, our USB-C port for both charging and video out, a 3.5mm headphone jack, which works just fine, and then also a micro SD card slot. Now, an important factor when getting a streaming handheld is the screen experience. If you think about it, that's basically what you're paying for, is controls and a screen, because all the work is being done on some other device, like a home computer or over the cloud. And so it's really the screen and the controls that really matter. And luckily, the screen on this device is pretty great. It has a nice saturation of colors. It seems to be well balanced in terms of temperature as well. It gets bright enough to even be able to use outdoors. For example, here under shade, you can see that actually it looks pretty good. Now, if we go out of the shade into direct sunlight, it does get a little bit harder to see, but it's still bright enough that I would say it's playable. Also, when playing it in a dark environment, for example, here in the studio with the lights off, it's actually pretty dim as well. Now, playing it in a purely dark environment, for example, in bed next to your significant other, it's a little bit more bright than I would like, but still definitely playable. Another thing worth noting is that a 7-inch device gives you a pretty impressive screen to work with, especially compared to something like the Retroid Pocket 5, which has a 5.5-inch screen. Now the Retroid has an OLED panel, so I think the colors are going to be better on this. It also gets brighter and dimmer. But you can see there is a night and day difference between the screen sizes right here. And when it comes to streaming, you're mostly going to be playing more modern games where you are going to want to have a larger screen to be able to see all the text and everything else going on. Now comparing it to the Logitech G Cloud, which has a similar 1080p 7-inch model, you can see that the colors are actually better on the Absolute One Pro. If you look at the car, it's got a much deeper red. In fact, this is almost getting to the point of being one of the better LCD panels that I've used before. Now it doesn't hold a candle to something like the Odin 2 Portal, which has a 7-inch 1080p panel, but it is 120Hz, so double the refresh rate, and it's also OLED and stunning. So long story short, even though this is only an LCD panel, I think it's good enough when it comes to streaming. It gets nice and bright, it has vibrant colors, and yeah, I think that 7 inches is the sweet spot when it comes to streaming as well. Now let's take a listen to the audio, which has been improved in this model. They're using improved speakers, so let's take a listen. Overall, I think it actually sounds pretty good. This is only at 75% volume because this gets very, very loud. It's not quite as bassy and impressive as I was hoping, but I've also been told by the company that they're still tuning the audio, so there is room for improvement. Either way, I think it's going to work great for most use case scenarios, so I've got no issues with the audio altogether. Now, before we jump into the streaming aspect of the device, which I think is really the focal point of this handheld in the first place, I want to talk a little bit more about the emulation performance and what you can expect, because this device can do more than just stream games from the cloud or your computer. So I'm going to breeze through some of this stuff just because I think it's kind of a given that you're going to be able to play things like Game Boy and Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance absolutely no problem. It is worth noting that many of these games look very good on a 7-inch display, especially when you use things like special shaders and things like that to really dial in the experience so that it feels like a retro gaming console, and you can definitely do that here. When it comes to the home console system, it's going to be the same thing here, so Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, all these are going to play really great. Again, you have the ability to use things like CRT shaders to enhance the experience if you would like as well. We've got enough performance power here to be able to handle things like CRT shaders as well as just these systems themselves, so no issues here when it comes to playing retro games. The upgrade on the D-pad is definitely something that I appreciated in all my testing as well, because these games are a bit of a joy to actually play with a good, solid D-pad. I also found that I really enjoyed playing arcade games on this device because it has an analog stick-centric layout. And so for me, it feels very natural to be able to play these sorts of games with an analog stick. It basically feels like a smaller joystick. Now with the previous Absolute, the performance capped out at the PlayStation 1. Basically, this is the best that you could get, and you obviously can play that on the Absolute One Pro as well, but things get a lot better from there. Nintendo 64 is a great example. This was very sluggish on the original, but now I can play all these Nintendo 64 games upscaled to 1440p. And so we are seeing a very big jump in performance to the point where I would say that this can play Nintendo 64 absolutely no problem. When it comes to Dreamcast, I also found this to be very good. Again, I'm upscaling everything to 1440p and using widescreen cheats and hacks when available. And yes, this is playing absolutely fine. And so I would say that yes, we can now play Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast with an upscaled resolution with very little fiddling in the settings. This basically is plug and play. Now when it comes to Sega Saturn, I found it to be greatly improved, but not quite perfect. Ideally, I would use the Beetle Saturn core within RetroArch, which is a much more accurate emulator, which is going to play these games a lot better. Unfortunately, this device is not quite up to the task of being able to play all the games with Beetle. Thankfully, they all run pretty well with the Yabusan Shiro core, which is still a very good core, but more performance-minded. So I would say you are going to be able to play Sega Saturn games on this, and probably almost the entirety of the catalog, but it's not going to be quite as accurate as using that Beetle Saturn core with more powerful and more expensive handhelds. I think the last system I would consider to be fully playable on the Absolute One Pro is going to be Sony PSP. You can play almost every single game at a 4x resolution, which is a 1080p upscale, which is going to look great on this device since it's actually matching the panel. And the vast majority of the PSP games that I played worked absolutely fine here, and they look very good on this vibrant display with an entire 7 inches to work with. A couple of the games I did have to downscale to a 3x resolution or a 1080p, like with God of War Chains of Olympus, but again, I think it still looks very good. So this also, I would say, is a very capable PSP handheld. However, after that, you do start to hit a bottleneck in terms of performance, so I did want to capture this pretty well, and I think that showing benchmarks here will give you an idea of how this is performing compared to other similar handhelds. We're going to use the 3D Mark Wildlife score, and you can see here that the score on the device on its own is about 1200. And to give you context, the original abxylute got about 350 when using this exact same test, so it's almost 4 times better with the new Pro versus the older model. It's also about 20% better than the Logitech G Cloud in terms of raw performance power. And this is also a device that I classified as being PSP capable, but not much beyond that. Now, once we get to this level, it does get a little bit hard to articulate just exactly what you can play, but I think a good comparison will be with the Anbernic RG556, which has the Unisoc T820 chipset inside. And you can see here that the abxylute has about 60% of the performance power of the RG556, which is a device that I classified as being mostly able to play GameCube and PS2. Going up from there, if we compare it to the Retroid Pocket 5, you can see that this one's almost 4 times more powerful than the Absolute One Pro, so there is a big performance gap. It's also worth noting that these are of a similar price, about $250 for the Retroid Pocket 5 after taxes and shipping and all that. Now, if we go even further to the high-end tier of Android devices, it gets even more wonky because these are so powerful that it will max out that 3D Mark Wildlife test. And so the Odin 2 Portal, which is about $330 before shipping and all of that, you can see is a lot more powerful of a handheld compared to the Absolute One Pro. So now let's look at what the performance is going to look like on the Absolute from a practical perspective. And I would say for Nintendo GameCube, it's actually pretty good. Most games will play at a 2x resolution upscale. It's not quite enough to actually take advantage of the full 1080p resolution on this display, but it still looks very sharp and crisp. And I would say the vast majority of the games that I played were absolutely playable, at least 75% of the catalog, but maybe even closer to 80%. Every once in a while, I would have to dip it down to a 1x or native resolution, but for the most part, just setting it to a 2x resolution upscale with the Vulkan backend did really well. But there were definitely performance bottlenecks with this emulator, and I think the best example is going to be F-Zero GX. Even in the first level, which is one of the easier levels to run, it's only running at about 60% performance speed, and this is with a 1x or native resolution. So definitely not every GameCube game is going to be playable on this device, but it is impressive just how many actually were. Now, strangely, it's completely different with the Nintendo Wii, even though this only takes a little bit more performance power. I think it's just really hitting a bottleneck at this point, and so almost every Nintendo Wii game bogged down a lot. And even the easier games to run, like Sonic Colors or New Super Mario Bros. U, these just chugged, at 30 or 40% performance, and so I'm not really sure that any Nintendo Wii games are going to be playable on this device. Instead, I would just stick to the GameCube games because those were a lot more impressive. Now, PlayStation 2 was also hit and miss, but a lot more miss than actual hits. There were some games that I could play at a 2x resolution no problem, especially lighter weight games like Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution. However, once I got into the more 3D style games, things like Jak and Daxter and Ratchet and Clank, these ones would start to bog down at about a 2x resolution upscale. So it's not going to give you perfect performance, but if you don't mind a little bit of slowdown here and there, I would still say it's pretty playable even at this 2x resolution. It's really going to come down to what you can tolerate. I found for myself that I just turned off the metrics so I wouldn't see when it actually bogged down. You could still kind of feel it, but again, that's kind of how it was on the original PlayStation 2, where we would get slowdown in some of these games. And so I think this is probably the limit of what I would expect. However, once you get to some of the harder to run PS2 games, you will definitely see some issues. Even if you try to play it with, say, for example, some underclocking and at that native resolution, it's still nowhere close to being playable with a lot of these harder to play games. So I don't think there's enough tweaking and hacks that you can do to make games like God of War or Shadow of the Colossus actually playable on this device. So the way I would categorize it is that this is not a PS2 capable handheld. It's close, and there are games that can play, but I would consider them to be added bonuses as opposed to buying this game specifically to play PlayStation 2 games. And once you go beyond that, you're going to find a lot of problems. For example, with Nintendo 3DS emulation, this is all over the place. I tried a bunch of different emulator apps and I found all sorts of issues, either from performance or just from the Mali GPU. There are definitely still some games that are playable and an enjoyable experience, but again, it's kind of like PS2, where I would consider it to be an added bonus, and for the most part, I would not have high expectations when it comes to 3DS. And everything beyond that's going to be pretty lousy, so Nintendo Wii U and Nintendo Switch, these are just not even worth trying, because even the more lightweight games will get bogged down. For example, with Wii U, I couldn't get past the title screen for most of the games that I actually wanted to play. And so when it comes to emulation performance, it is greatly improved from the original model, and it's about what I would expect for a streaming-focused handheld that isn't really meant to play emulation. You can still play a lot of stuff, just don't really count on things like PS2 and beyond. Now, because this is an Android-based device, you can still play Android games on this as well. And so if you are looking for something to play what I would consider to be a little bit more on the lightweight side, then yes, you can play a lot of Android games as well. For example, here with Minecraft in the default settings, it runs really well, so no issues here. In general, I would say that yeah, you can probably play a lot of good Android games, but I wouldn't push it too hard. Again, if it's struggling to play PS2 games, then it'll probably struggle to play things like, Genshin Impact. But I think the vast majority of people who are considering a device like this are going to be interested in things like game streaming as opposed to native gameplay. And it's also a focal point of the abxylute team as well. They've got this app called abxy Game, which is basically just integrated with Xbox Cloud Gaming. And so it has a bunch of games that they recommend, but you can make your own favorites and things like that. So you can use this as like your front-end launcher if you would like. And if you start up one of these games and log in with your Xbox Game Pass, it'll actually just go to the Cloud Gaming Beta app within it. And so you can just launch your games directly from the abxy app as well. Now for me, testing cloud gaming is always a challenge because I live in Hawaii, and so our connection is just pretty terrible, and so I always feel lag and things like that when playing games on the cloud, but I still did try it out. And from a functionality perspective, yeah, it worked absolutely fine. I was able to get in and out of my games. Having the embedded Xbox button was also very handy because I didn't have to swipe on the screen at all. Again, I could feel the input latency when trying to play this, but that's just kind of par for the course when trying to do cloud streaming here in Hawaii. For me personally, I prefer remote play, doing local game streaming from my Xbox within the same network. And so for the most part, when I wanted to play console games, this is how I would play it, both with my PS5 as well as my Xbox Series S. And the overall experience here was very good. The input latency was low, the ergonomics were not the best, but those sticks also helped in just the overall enjoyment. And so I think from a local remote play perspective, this is a very good handheld as well. Another thing I tried out a lot was local remote play with my PC using the app called Apollo and Artemis. I recently did a video about this, I'll leave it linked down below, but essentially this has become the de facto way that I've been doing PC game streaming over the past few months. Of course, this will require you to have a gaming PC to stream from, so this is not the same as like NVIDIA GeForce Now. I'm actually doing this locally from my gaming PC over to this handheld. It just so happened that I'm in the middle of testing a mini PC for gameplay performance, and so not only was I able to test the device itself and see how it played in terms of just, overall frames per second and performance, I also could test the streaming at the same time. And the experience here was very good. The Artemis app actually allows you to see all the statistics as you're streaming, and I found that the overall decoding time was about 10 milliseconds, which I think is pretty darn good. To put that into perspective, it's to the point where I could play games like Celeste, which is a very precision-based platformer, and it felt like I was playing it natively on the screen. So no issues here playing a game like this, which is very demanding in terms of input delay. And so I think this is where the abxylute One Pro really shines. Yes, it has a more powerful chipset, and it can play up through PSP, and that's always great. For example, if you wanted to take it on a plane or whatever, but I think that streaming is really what the focal point of this device really is. So let's talk a little bit about what you're getting if you're just focusing on streaming in terms of the price point, which is going to be about $200 pre-order and then $250 when it goes to retail, compared to other devices that you can get on the market. Let's start by talking about the Logitech G Cloud. This one retails for $300 right now, but it is often on sale, and you can usually find it for around $250 if you just wait a couple weeks for the next sale to pop up. So I'd say the Logitech is still a little bit more expensive than the abxylute, at least in full retail when you compare them one to another. And I'm a little bit torn between which one I actually prefer between the two. From a functional standpoint, even though the Logitech G Cloud only has Wi-Fi 5, I found that it had the exact same performance metrics when using Artemis and Apollo. So this one's also getting about 10 milliseconds of decoding time, and so it feels nice and snappy, just like it does with the abxylute One Pro. I'd also say that the Logitech has much better ergonomics, but I prefer the D-pad, the face buttons, as well as the sticks on the Absolute. I kind of wish that we had a hybrid between the two, with the Logitech's ergonomics, but all the controls of the Absolute. I think that would be a winner right there. So I think as it stands right now, between the two, if they're both going to be at a similar price point, and I had to choose which one I would rather play, I'm going to surprise myself and pick the Absolute one here. Even though the ergonomics are worse, the sticks and the face buttons and the D-pad really do kind of make up for it. If the company actually releases a grip for this device to make it a lot chunkier and more comfortable, I think it's a very easy winner at that point. Now, honestly, when it comes to big screen streaming handhelds at this price point, there is not a lot of other things that we can choose from. And so I think we have to go a different route and talk about how we can just stream things on the cheap. And probably the cheapest way that you can go with a big screen is going to be to buy a very cheap tablet, which you can find on Amazon. These are often going for about $80 to $100. The nice thing about these is that many of them have Wi-Fi 6, and they also have a 10-inch display, which is a 16:10 aspect ratio. And these 10-inch handhelds actually are a perfect fit for one of my favorite telescopic controllers, the GameSir G8 Plus. This one is a Bluetooth controller, but extends quite a bit more than the original G8, so it makes it very easy to be able to use a tablet like this with no additional configuration. I actually have a very similar setup right here. I've got the Aldo Cube tab right here, which is I think about a $150 tablet that I will use from time to time. And of course, I've got the GameSir G8 Plus, which I've talked about a lot on this channel. And so putting these two together is actually very simple. And there are some really good benefits to this. For example, the GameSir G8 plus one of those cheaper Wi-Fi 6 tablets is going to set you back about $150. But it's also going to give you a larger 10-inch display, which is a really excellent experience in terms of just overall immersiveness. However, one word of caution is that I found that the decoding time with Apollo and Artemis was quite a bit worse than the other options that we were just looking at, like the Absolute and the Logitech. This tablet in particular only has Wi-Fi 5, so not Wi-Fi 6 like some of the more recent tablets that have been released, but you can see here that the delay is about 40 milliseconds compared to 10. Now, to be honest, if I hadn't seen the decoding time up here on the top left, I would not have felt a difference between the two. So whether or not you're sensitive to the input latency might be a factor right here, just in the fact that this one tablet in particular did have a longer decoding time compared to the other dedicated handhelds. There's also something to be said that slapping a tablet inside of a telescopic controller does not give you that immersive handheld feeling like a dedicated device like the Absolute One Pro or the Logitech G Cloud. But at the very least, I did want to bring this up as an option where you actually can get a larger screen and better controls for a cheaper price than the Absolute One Pro if you're willing to live with this overall slapped-on experience. After that, the only other real viable option when it comes to game streaming on a larger screen is going to be with those really high-end Android devices like the Odin 2 Portal. And this one is a lot more powerful and has a lot more bells and whistles. It's got a 120 Hz refresh rate and it's OLED. It's just a beautiful device. This is my preferred way to play game streaming. But it's also not cheap. It's $330 before shipping and taxes. And like I mentioned before, I think it's basically a requirement to get that grip as well. So you are looking at a device that is a lot more expensive, almost twice the price of the Absolute One Pro. And so it's really going to come down to what you personally plan on playing. If it's going to be game streaming only, I can't imagine paying $400 for this experience, but of course you do you. Instead, I think the Odin 2 Portal is a better fit for somebody who wants a large screen for emulation performance as well as game streaming, because it does both very well. The Absolute, on the other hand, is kind of in a middle ground where it is a cheaper price but still gives you some pretty good performance up through PSP, and it does do streaming pretty well, other than those ergonomics, which do give me pause. So now that we've kind of picked apart the whole experience of using this device, let's start wrapping up with a new screen of what I like and what I don't like about this new Absolute One Pro. Let's start with what I like, and many of these things are going to be similar or at least improved upon from the original Absolute. Number one, I think it's still a good screen, 1080p, 7 inches, and I think it's very nice and vibrant for being an LCD panel. I also think these sticks have been greatly improved, and they're some of my favorite that I've ever tried. And the audio was pretty decent on the original, but I think it's been improved now. In fact, I really like it. Performance has also gotten better. We can now play easily PSP and everything down below. You can also play most GameCube games and quite a few PS2 games, but I would think of those as added bonuses. I also think that it gets the job done when it comes to streaming, especially when it comes to local remote play, which is what I prefer. The input latency on it was good enough for me to feel like I was playing natively on the device, which is the target area when it comes to a streaming handheld. But of course it's not perfect, so let's talk about some of the things that I didn't like about the experience. The first two should come as no surprise because they are the exact same as they were before. I'm not a fan of these ergonomics, and I think that the corners around the edges are just a little bit too sharp. I'm also disappointed that after 2 years of having this device, the company did not change out the shell at all, other than to have a transparent option, because I think there's a lot of room for improvement here. And also, over my past 2 weeks of testing, I couldn't help but feel that this device is stuck somewhere in the middle between being an emulation device as well as a streaming device, and it doesn't really succeed in either. It is great that it has improved emulation performance, but if you're going to be spending $200 to $250 on a device to emulate games, you can get a lot more bang for your buck with something like the Retroid Pocket 5. In addition, if you're looking only for game streaming, you can get a lot more value in something like a cheaper tablet with a better controller. That's going to allow you to save a little bit of money, get a bigger screen, and then also you can use that tablet for other things like watching movies. And so when it comes down to it, I found that the abxylute One Pro is a pretty decent handheld, but I'm not really sure who it's for. If it's somebody who really wants a nice 7-inch display device, then yes, it's going to work. But the ergonomics really hold it back for me, to the point where I don't really enjoy playing this device. I really wish it had a grip. At this point, I still don't think that we have a solid $200 streaming handheld. This definitely gets us closer to that point, but we need something that's comfortable to hold, easy to use, and has a big, beautiful screen. That's really all we really need, but unfortunately, each one of these devices falls a little bit short. The Logitech Cloud has those ergonomics, and it's great, and then the abxylute has almost everything but ergonomics going for it. And so in the end, much like with the original abxylute, I have a hard time recommending the abxylute One Pro. It's still, $200 to $250, and we haven't seen an improvement in the ergonomics, which is one of the biggest factors for me when it comes to game streaming. We just haven't found that $200 sweet spot when it comes to a streaming handheld with a nice big screen and good controls, and I think that we should continue to demand it, because once we get to that point, it's going to be something that's really interesting for me, because for an additional $200, we can take like the home gaming console or your gaming PC that you have at home and then stream to it with something that feels good, and the abxylute is just so close to it, but not quite there for me. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Have you been trying to get your hands on a good streaming handheld as well? And what have you settled on? A tablet with a controller? Or do you think that maybe something like the abxylute is the way to go? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.